Ladies and gentlemen, the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland is linked to the previous presentation in an interesting way. In the good example you had from the slot machine association, you were told that we have 3 companies handing out money, and there is a difference in the systems. Veikkaus, who is doing the betting, and Lotto, they are actually handing over the benefits, the leftovers from the games, to the Ministry of Culture and Education. And we then use this money for funding NGOs. So if we look at, for example, the youth field, the main part of the money channeled to youth organizations is coming from this system. The same goes, for example, for sports, and also to some extent in the fields of culture and science. Now, where did I get the next slide? Let's see. Here it is. Yeah. Well, I was asked to talk briefly on empowerment of young people, and if we look at empowerment of young people and children, it is indeed a cross-sectoral approach that we need, because the questions in empowerment are quite different in the different fields. I have started with health as the first one, and there is a specific reason for that. Health is perhaps one of the most significant fields that we all have to do with a lot, and where we actually encounter discussions on empowerment, on decision making, on whom will get what treatments and when. We have the same for the social sector and for education. If we think about empowerment of young people and participation, in education it's usually compulsory to some degree to take part in education. And even if the system will allow for private schools or public schools or even home education, it is usually not the child who is deciding on what form they are taking. It's the parents. So when we think about a lot of the services that we provide, it's usually on a parental guidance that we approach children and youth. And the same goes, of course, with economic and political power. So the empowerment concept as such is very much about finding way for marginalized individuals and groups to have a voice. Now, I think we should be cautious when we talk about marginalization. It's very much about perspective, from whose perspective we are looking at things. If we look at the field of children and youth, there are some fields where they are clearly marginalized, if we look at political power, for example. Whereas in education, it's probably not the case. If we look at societies at large and the resources they put in to education, children are usually prioritized quite well. So it's not a question always about resources and measuring them, but then how they are used. And that is perhaps the question in education, especially on the choice, the freedom for the group, for the individual to decide on what education they want. So who is marginalized from what and to what extent? That is one thing that we have been talking about in the European Union very much now, about the youth guarantee. and looking on marginalization from the perspective of work and work life, the question of how to enter into a productive work life. There's again the question of whose perspective. Is it an interest of young people, for example, to take their exams very fast and then go straight on to working life? Or are people benefited by taking a year off between and to get to know life and all the skills you need at the workplace later on? And here we have actually a very close connection to the question of NGOs, because a lot of the work that is done in NGOs rely on people putting up their free time, using time, and for young people especially, that can mean that they take off a year from a curricula or take a break from work or studying and go and do something abroad, perhaps, where they take part in associations, work, and where they grow as individuals. Now, the key issues for empowerment then is information, if we look at the individual, and autonomy. As I said, to be part of a system and to have a say, for example, on the form of education you have, you need to have information about the choices you have. And you had, of course, to have autonomy to choose between them. And then there is the question of self-management that is typically also linked with empowerment and groups. And this is perhaps the key issue in youth work, where we look on empowerment, we look on it very much from the self-management perspective. We kind of rely on that young people have information, and we kind of rely on that they are autonomous and can stand for their voice. And what we are looking for is how they organize events, how self-management is made in practice. If I take an example from the field of youth work that is typical for the ministerial perspective, financing of different projects. Is a project a good project? Can it reach out to young people? How much are young people involved themselves in planning and performing the projects? So here the self-management part is perhaps crucial in looking at the quality of projects in youth work. Usually then there is an argument that is bringing us back to the question of age, and that is the thing about immediate and direct consequences as opposed to long-term effects. And one can say that if we look on participation as part of the package of empowerment, that is the main argument that is used against children and young people making a choice from themselves. You could say that you don't let your children eat candy before dinner because they will not see the effect of how they will eat, destroy their appetite. So there's a long-term and kind of really short-term, but on a very big scale, it's the question about how you eat. And how do you explain these things in more complicated matters within society? So empowerment can be looked at on different levels. Societal level, on individual choice, in kindergarten groups, what you will do in the next hour, or what you will do during the next term. There are different things, and we grown-ups tend to have a very fixed perspective in our plans on how to treat young people and children. In this, I think we need to go back to the question of asking when people are mature enough to make their decisions themselves, because age is the big question usually when you look at participation. And here we interestingly have the question of health first. We have the mature minor doctrine, especially in common law, the question about when somebody is mature enough to choose or reject a treatment in health. And the other extreme, you can have, for example, the question of the parliament in Belgium that passed a bill allowing euthanasia for terminally ill children. Who is to decide what and when? Is this parents? Are there children? Who are you going to ask, and how on? Is there a bigger question than life and death? If one can be a part in that process, one can perhaps choose also what political party to govern the country, or perhaps what kind of school meals you want to have, or do you need to have school uniforms or something like that. So there's a big question, I think, about when we do think that children are mature enough, and usually I think one could say that we grown up, we don't treat the same questions the same way. We have different standards for different questions, and sometimes we come up with very conflicting standards for when we think young people and children should be empowered. And I think that is perhaps one of the main messages I would like to leave with you, and that is the question of when we think we should let people be empowered. And that is the question about how we are giving means to young people and children for empowerment. I will briefly give you an example of I'm going the wrong way there in this, of the Finnish system. We have a youth barometer that is made. It's a questionnaire with about 2,000 young people, and if we look at that, we can see that young people are not very interested in empowerment in a traditional way. They do not take action in political parties, for example. Only 7% of them are interested in politics in that way. On the other hand, when we ask them about voting and how they should look at other low threshold ways of influencing, we can see that young people consider voting very important. And even if it's not very common for young people, if they have the right to vote. And they think usually that it's really good to give feedback directly on services. On the other hand, they do not deem them effective. So there is a contradiction on what you think is effective and what you actually do. And here I think there is the question of time and the time lag. There are some things that we allow people to take part in, and we can see that they, through this channel, can give immediate response, whereas voting is not a process where you give immediate response. It's a long-term thing, and therefore we have excluded young people in our way of designing the system there. Last, I would like to show you a picture on the question of lowering the voting age, because this is one of the main factors that people are talking about in European politics. Should younger people be able to vote? And you can see that is interesting enough, or not very curious as such, that there is a stronger opposition to it as young people grow older. On the other hand, you can see that also for the group here in Finland, being 15 to 17, that would be the persons who would be given the vote, there is not an extremely big interest in this, even if they deem that this is one of the most important ways to affect society. So here is a contradiction that we need to talk about and need to discuss with young people. The main obstacles to influence then seems to be that young people feel that there is a lack of time and a lack of meaningful ways to influence. And I think this is a message for us that we need to look on our services, we need to look at our policies, and we need to look at feedback systems, measurements and indicators in this field more closely than we have done before. And when we do design this feedback system, these indicators, we need to take young people on board, and we need to make spaces in these feedback forms, these indicators for young people, and for example having a grid where you can have enough of young people taking part in questionnaires, even if it's usually said it's hard to have young people fill out questionnaires. They can do it with help of grown-ups or a bit older peers. Thank you.